Good evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Interviews, the series in which I interview creators of vampire properties, authors of vampire fiction, not actual vampires. Yet. Tonight, I am very honored to have joining me novelist and critic Kim Newman, famous for writing a whole lot of vampire things, but notably the Anno Dracula series. Anno Dracula is an alternate history sequel to Dracula with the premise of what if Dracula won and took over all of England. And the book itself is a Victorian gothic mashup featuring just about every single classic Victorian horror, monster, detective, character you've ever heard of. So you can see why I'm a fan. And author Kim Newman is so good to join us now from the very far away and distant spooky gothic land of Britain via Zoom. Kim, thank you for joining us tonight.
I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. You ready to talk about vampires?
Always.
Okay, well, first of all, why do you write about vampires? What is it about vampires that speaks to you?
I suppose it's everything. Of all the monsters, they're the ones with the most variety. They've got the most possible meanings. They are multivalent. And I like that. I like that there are lots of different interpretations. And I'm sort of interested in exploring that, which I've done in my own work. I mean, I always think that what's interesting about vampires, why they stand out among their other monsters, among their peers, is you can have a conversation with a vampire. There's no book called Interview with a Werewolf, because it would be very short, right? Or Interview with a Zombie, which would just be grunting. You can have a conversation with the Frankenstein monster, but only if you're Dr. Frankenstein, seems to be. Everybody else just gets the broken neck. Whereas vampires you can sit down and talk to. They have a point of view. They have all kinds of other interesting stuff about them that's worth exploring. They are still ineffably the coolest of the classic monsters. From a personal point of view, my sort of moment of introduction to horror as a genre was watching the Bela Lugosi movie of Dracula when I was very young. And so still to me, that's like the primal, I always think it's like the moment in Batman's origin where the bat comes through the window, yes. But that's me watching Dracula when I'm 11, and then deciding on the course of the rest of my life. And it's not underestimating the impact of that television viewing, to say that it did dictate the course of the rest of my life. We are 50 years on from that, and I'm still processing that movie, and Dracula, in the sort of wider sense of the book, and all other manifestations and all other cultural elements of it. I don't know if you follow the social media posts I do of Dracula of the Day, but that's been going for over a year now, and I keep finding more odd and unusual variants there, which I am archiving on my own site.
Where do you post those for people to go find them?
I post them on Twitter, also on Facebook, on my own page, but there's a Facebook group dedicated to my books, and I post them there. But you can I archive them on my site because social media just disappears. So over a year's worth of Your Daily Dracula is posted up on my site, including all the obvious ones, but lots and lots of less obvious ones. When I began this process, I thought, foolishly, that I had probably seen every single feature film about Dracula. Even close. No. Not even close. It's like every week I find some new Spanish comedy from the 70s I'd never heard of. And these days, it's surprisingly easy to track down films that you've hitherto never heard of. So I have a big archive ready to go of stuff that I've I've traced and looked at. So at the end of this, I will have seen, I think, every Dracula movie, but there are even more than I thought there were.
There's Dracula's been depicted in media, not just movies, but TV shows, books, comics, whatever, more than any other character in the history of anything ever. Followed closely by Sherlock Holmes, but Dracula still beats him out.
Yeah.
So it's going to take a long time before you get them all.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I when I started, I thought there were about 3 months worth of this. Now there's at least another year. And if I keep discovering stuff at the rate that I am, probably another year beyond that. I don't know what happens when we get to scraping the barrel. But
then you have to start making more yourself, right?
I think, well, yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
So when you watched that film when you were 11, what was it about it that spoke to you? Like, why at that moment in time did it affect you so deeply?
I honestly don't know. I think I was probably at a point in my life when I was receptive to all kinds of things, and I wasn't exactly looking for things to be interested in or obsessed with. And it's fair to say that as a teenager, and to some extent now, I was obsessed with monsters and horror and Dracula in particular. It just was one of those coming together moments, and almost instantly, I went from being a viewer to being a fan. I mean, it's like the next morning I was a horror movie fan, and because back then the only way of recapturing the experience of watching a movie was to read the book it was based on. By the end of the week, I'd got a copy of Dracula, and I was a horror literature fan. And somehow I knew very early on that I also wanted to write. So I wrote like a one-page play version of Dracula that I made my friends put on in our drama class at school. Luckily, that's lost. But it still dictated, as I say, the course of the rest of my life. I knew that I wanted to study this. I wanted to learn more about the not just the Dracula, the story and the character and the people who made the movie and the man who wrote the book, but just even the whole process of writing books and making movies. I think I became interested in that from this moment, and that's sort of what set me on the course to doing all the things I do today, 50 years later. So I mean, who knows? I mean, I could have stayed up. I know that the next week, the late night movie was Some Like It Hot. If I'd seen that, at first, maybe I would have become the world's biggest Marilyn Monroe fan, and spent my life chronicling drag acts. But and I do like Some Like It Hot, but not in the way I like Dracula. So
you talked about all the different metaphors and things that vampires can represent and how versatile they are. Are you familiar with the trope, our vampires are different?
No, but I pretty instantly understand what you mean.
It's kind of self-explanatory, right? So anytime you see a movie, they're like, well, we're not going to be like Dracula. We're going to make our vampires different somehow. So they'll mix it up. And they can do it with what kind of powers they have or what kind of weaknesses they have or how they look or how they function in society. But in terms of what they represent, those metaphors, even in the book Dracula itself, you can read it with a lot of different metaphorical takes. For the vampires you write and the Dracula you write, how are your vampires different? How do you use vampires in your
my
way?
Vampires aren't different. My vampires are the same, but they're the same as all of them. I mean, I decided that what I was going to do was just take everybody's vampires and play with them in turn. Obviously, I wanted Dracula to be the arch vampire in my series, although he's not actually in it very much, which is something I took from Bram Stoker. And I thought at the time I was writing, it was a bit before the Francis Coppola film, but I could already see the way things were going in vampire stories. And I thought, although I wanted to write vampires who were complicated characters and not necessarily all bad, I think I decided that I wanted Dracula to be evil. I wanted to go back to the idea of Dracula as a monster. I wanted him to be somebody even other vampires were afraid of or intimidated by or annoyed by. And so that was my take on Dracula. He is Stoker's character. He's a brutal, horrible person. But I then surrounded him with lots of other characters who have subtly or blatantly differing approaches to living forever and drinking blood. And I think that was the sort of the thing that enabled me to move on, was just decide that not all my vampires were going to be the same. I think there is, until maybe the 1970s, almost all film and literary vampires were the same character. They were, even in the sense that Dracula and Carmilla are the same character. They are appetite-driven sociopaths. And it's not really until maybe Dark Shadows, it was the thing that cracked that and came up with the romantic, tortured, reluctant version of Dracula, later associated with Anne Rice, although I think Blackula probably is strangely the most influential film in that mode, although Blackula owes a lot to Dark Shadows. But subsequently, we have various different takes on what vampires might be like, and different readings there are. I suppose the idea of vampire as lifestyle fantasies that crept in quite early on in the genre. I think there's the character in Son of Dracula in 1943 who wants to be a vampire, who I think is actually the unique. I mean, she's like the first aspirational vampire in the mythology, and she's actually a really cool and interesting character who's not often remembered as a sort of goth forerunner. And I just kept thinking, well, there are all these other versions of vampires that have been maybe overwritten or forgotten or not played. And I even wanted to deal with the fact that quite a lot of other vampire characters are imitations of Dracula, because I thought if Dracula was a celebrity, naturally there'd be people who copied him, but weren't as good or weren't as bad or just didn't stack up to him. So that's why in my book I included all those characters like Count Yorga and Baron Meinster, who are all like knockoff Draculas. I thought of them as Draculas who were a bit short and not as well dressed, and trying to get the style right and couldn't.
So in Anno Dracula, you focus a lot on the political metaphors and what vampires would do to society. And it's literal in the book. The vampires are literally affecting politics, but it still is connecting to that metaphor that they were in the beginning. Why did that interest you so much?
I had the idea quite in something like the very late 70s. I wrote that book in the early 90s. And so it's very informed by the politics of the 1980s. I mean, I remember it came out and one of my friends said, this is a book about Margaret Thatcher, isn't it? And I'd never actually explicitly thought of it like that. But yeah, it is. I don't know if you remember this or it was much publicized, but during the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher did this thing about talking about Victorian values and saying we should get back to Victorian values. And of course, Victorian values were what she meant was like hard work and self-reliance and enterprise and all that. But it's hard not to take out that meant, brutal exploitation, a hideously ossified class system, all kinds of imperial horrors, all of which, frankly, she also endorsed.
Right.
And so it did feel, they kept talking about the Victorian era over and over, and it's the period of Dracula, which is published in 1897, although it sums up, it was written over a long period. It's a really fascinating sort of 15, 20 years in lots and lots of things. It's the birth of many mass media. I mean, the cinema is invented more or less at the same time Dracula is being written. There are all kinds of evolutionary things going on in politics and society, and you can think of there's a period between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is in the mid 1880s, and maybe the end period would be about World War One with, say, The Lost World or The Phantom of the Opera. But in that span, there are like 50 literary works created, which are essentially franchises to this day. Dracula is one, Sherlock Holmes, Peter Pan, all of H.G. Wells's stories, the ghost stories of M.R. James, the great novels of Henry James and Joseph Conrad, Rider Haggard, all these stories, Trilby, all these stories which, even if they're not read much today, Oscar Wilde's in there too, are stories that people recognize, that well over a century on still resonate. You cannot go through a year without these stories being revived, them doing different versions of. The Wizard of Oz is in there as well, and a whole bunch of Westerns, the Virginian, Riders of the Purple Sage, early detective stories, sort of development of scientific detection, the development of
like forensics.
Yeah, but also the way that stories are distributed, not just in novels, but through magazine serials or whatever. Let's say there's this astonishingly fertile period. I think it's unmatched. I cannot think of another period in history where you had just so many works coming out, not necessarily a golden age of great literature, although there are major writers, Thomas Hardy, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, through this period, but of great popular literature, of characters and ideas and concepts and stories that are, it seems, are permanent additions to our repertoire of stories, in the way that I don't know, the Greek myths or the Norse mythology are. They're stories that'll be retold forever. And I look back on this particular period with some kind of awe in terms of just the inventiveness of a bunch of people who kind of knew each other and had a complicated web of connections. And sometimes would answer back each other as well. But this is almost still, I don't know, 50% of horror is that stuff. A vast percentage of our popular culture now, well over 100 years after this period ended, is wrapped up in these stories. We keep going back, and I don't know how many versions of Peter Pan have there been in the last 20 years. You'd think that the story would end up. Yeah, Alice in Wonderland is a bit earlier, but it's also in this pile. You think that and there have been some stories that were popular then that didn't last, but the hit rate of those decades is astonishing. And that was the thing about that era that made me want to write Anno Dracula, set right in the middle of all this, but also maybe to look at all these other forms. And I did try and write a book that was, obviously it's a horror novel, but it's also a science fiction novel, a serial killer murder mystery, a historical romance, a kind of novel of satire and comedy of manners, and a behind the scenes of politics drama. It's a conspiracy story. So something that used all the generic forms that were created or perfected in that era could be, wrapped into one big ball of strange. I also wanted it to be fun, which I think is probably why it's lasted, rather than just approaching this thing with a high seriousness of purpose. I was also well aware that a lot of other people had done vampire books. And I did that's probably why I put off writing it for so long. I had the idea, I was working on it, I would occasionally talk to people about it, and it's one of those sort of back burner projects that I've got this Dracula idea I want to do, and then there'd be a whole bunch of other books. I think maybe not now, but eventually I was sort of prodded into it. And as soon as I finished it, I knew the story wasn't over. So I haven't remained sort of shackled to the world or the story ever since. I've done lots of other things, but I've also gone back to it periodically.
Victorian Gothic mashups are probably my favorite genre. I love them. And besides just mashing up the styles, you brought in those other characters, Jekyll and Hyde and Dr. Moreau and the Sherlock Holmes folks, even though they weren't on screen. Was it just, I don't want to say just for fun, but besides just loving it so much, were you trying to say something by putting all of those people together?
It was actually a functional thing in the first place. Obviously, I knew I was going to use some of the characters from Bram Stoker, because you couldn't not, even though I'd killed off quite a lot of the important ones. And one of the things that took me a while to develop was the idea of structuring the story around the Jack the Ripper murders. And I decided I wanted the opening that at that time every single Jack the Ripper film had. The fog, the bloke in the top hat with the bag of knives, the sort of the cheery prostitute in the doorway, the yellow ducks, all that kind of stuff. And then I looked at the history, and none of the murders were like that. That was just the fictional murders were like that. The real murders were sad, drab, and really upsetting. And I wanted some of that too, but later in the book. So I wanted to foreground it. And I realized I needed a fictional Jack the Ripper victim. And I sort of thought around a bit. And then I remembered that Lulu in Pandora's Box, the Frank Wedekind play filmed famously in Germany with Louise Brooks, was a Jack the Ripper victim. She's killed by Jack the Ripper at the end of the story. And then it struck me that Lulu was an interesting character because she's sort of a vampire. And it's such a great look. And I thought that would be terrific for me, because obviously the images that Jack the Ripper creeps up on the woman, she turns around, she has fangs. And I thought that Louise Brooks with fangs was a great image. And so having done that, having you brought in a character from a fiction that wasn't Dracula, then I realized that doing that solved a lot of my narrative problems. It occurred to me, because the premise of the book is that Dracula wins, kills Dr. Van Helsing and takes over Britain, that I'd need a lot of other vampires, because I think he could conquer a country on his own. He couldn't rule it on his own. And then, so I had to think of who would Dracula's gang be? And then I was, of course, it's all the other vampires of literature. And so I thought, okay, yeah, I've got to find something for Lord Ruthven from John Polidori's story, and something from Varney the Vampire, and a whole bunch of other Victorian vampire characters and characters from Hammer films and Mexican movies or whatever. And that opened it up to me think, obviously this is set not just in an alternate history, but in an alternate imaginary Victorian Britain, which is home to Sherlock Holmes and Jekyll and Hyde and Dr. Moreau and all these other
it just seemed natural to bring them in.
They're also great fun to write. I very much enjoy taking other people's characters and playing with them. I know this is sort of kind of creepy sometimes. There is an attitude, there is an element of critique of the original characters. And sometimes I would go back and look at the original work and find particularly some of those 19th century vampire stories, the characters are really thin, there's nothing much there. So that was quite good, because that allowed me to tip in extra elements and create slightly more distinctive characters. I sometimes forget where some of my characters came from originally, although I always try to acknowledge original writers. I confess I did set out to find, as it were, characters who had names and nothing else, because I could fill those. Whereas when writing characters like Dr. Jekyll or Lord Ruthven, who are actually really well delineated in their original works, that's much more like acting. That's much more leaning into the characters as written, and trying to catch the tone of the original writers, and also doing it in such a way that the book as a whole didn't end up being a a sort of bizarre hodgepodge.
And then you also have your original characters.
Mm.
There's Genevieve.
Yeah.
What is it about Genevieve that inspires you to keep using her in other properties as well? Like, she keeps showing up in different versions of her, but it's still her.
Well, I like writing her. I think she's interesting. I think she's funny. I wanted somebody who was a vampire but was not, as it were, associated with Dracula. And actually, I created the character in other books, so I took her from there. She is my character, but she appeared first in a book called Drachenfels, which I published under the pseudonym Jack Yeovil. And that's, it was a...
this one.
Yep, you got it there. That's the one. Yeah. And that's set in a universe I don't own. It's Games Workshop's kind of heroic fantasy universe. So that late medieval setting with magic and dwarves and fairies and all that kind of stuff. And I liked writing her there. And I'd written a bunch of stories about that version of her. But when I came to write Anno Dracula, I needed a vampire heroine, and I had one. So I imported her. I mean, I did change her. She has different middle name, and I fiddled around slightly with the spelling just to differentiate her from the Jack Yeovil Genevieve. It's Genevieve and Genevieve, and various other iterations have come in my other work. She's not quite the authorial viewpoint character, but she's quite close to it. And there are one or two other characters who are wholly mine. I tended to think that my major viewpoint characters should be ones that I made up. Although one or two of them aren't, but mostly I stick with that. I didn't particularly want to, I don't know, use Sherlock Holmes as a major character, for instance. There was too much built up around him. So although I wanted a detective, I invented my own.
So when writing a character like Genevieve, this very strong female character that's become so popular, do you have any feelings to share about writing a woman like that as a male author?
No, not really. I know that there's a callous and cruel answer to this answer in the movie As Good as It Gets, and I don't subscribe to that. I think that I use her outsider status, not just as a woman in Victorian society, but also as a French woman in England and as a vampire among human beings. No, I just try to empathize. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was influenced by some historical women. There are some really good sort of examples. I looked a lot at the lives of people like Annie Besant and Beatrice Webb, some of the early suffragettes, but mostly sort of social reformers or doctors, journalists, and just looked at what happened to them in their lives. But that's not really her character. I mean, the character was sort of formed beforehand. And as I say, I just wanted someone who observed from the outside. And then that became slightly complicated as the series went on. I developed other characters who interact with her and contrast with her. But no, it's not something I have ever particularly worried about. I have noticed that I have a tendency to use female viewpoint in quite a lot of my work. I wrote a couple of books set in a girls' school where the cast is almost entirely women. And as a reaction to that, I've just written a book which is about two blokes. You know, it's like I decided, no, I've got to prove I can write men as well, because it was becoming almost a reflex to write from a female viewpoint. So the current book is the viewpoint of a middle-aged alcoholic author who's a bloke. So,
well, you mentioned that she takes that metaphor of the vampire as an outsider, which is a very popular take on vampires. Dracula and the other vampires in the books don't have that take at all. They have a very different, this is what vampires mean feeling to them. So you have those two sides of the vampire both in the same novel, which is interesting.
Yeah, no, I liked that, and I also wanted the idea that there would be a range of not just what I think of as the role-playing game stuff, where you would decide attributes and all this kind of stuff, and powers, and work out on dice rolls who would beat who in a fight. It's more to do with attitudes and positions in the world and society, and how people feel about each other. And it just occurred to me that there have been other stories which had like vampire societies, but in them, vampire societies tend to be monolithic aristocracies. It's the sort of the aristocrats who keep human beings as cattle, that kind of stuff. And I thought the thing about aristocracies is they hate each other. They never get on. And also I wanted to spread vampires throughout society. So I also show poor, disadvantaged vampires. And partly it's to answer that age-old question of, if being a vampire is so great, why doesn't everybody do it? And my answer to that was to look at the tiny statistical sample we get in Dracula, is where there are 5 vampire characters in Dracula. We can kind of exclude the brides because we don't really get to know much about them. But we have Dracula, who's lived for hundreds of years and is enormously powerful and has to be defeated by this coalition of vampire hunters. And we have Lucy, who doesn't last a week. And my assumption was that for every Dracula, you got 10 vampires who don't make it, who blunder and can't handle the transformation, either physically or psychologically. My underlying rationale in the books is that there's something wrong with the Dracula bloodline. The variety of vampirism you get from him, there's something wrong with it that tends to make people rot or fall apart in the end, or become caricatures of themselves, but also to die. So I thought that it's not a clear thing. I wanted some characters to have a relatively easy, painless rebirth into another life, and some to go through hideous agonies that would last for decades, or would lead to them shriveling up to death. And this is mostly for plot reasons, but it became interesting thematic material.
And Genevieve is a very sympathetic vampire character. She has a lot of feelings. She has a moral compass. And a lot of the other vampires aren't, or don't, because of their vampire nature. Is that due to the bloodlines and that impurity in the bloodline? Is it due to their personality types as people?
It's partly because they're bad people.
Yeah.
Yeah. My assumption was that anybody who wanted to live forever by being a predator probably wouldn't be very nice. And so, I did think that, and this becomes a struggle in something that I worked on later on in the series with some other characters, the struggle to find an ethical way of living as a predator, which, I think it has a little to do with the way we've all thought recently, the whole idea of addressing your privilege, the notion that most of the people that we know and the people who read these books are in a relatively privileged status in the world. They can read for a start. And it's how you make your way in life while being dimly or acutely aware of the manifest suffering that maybe the greater part of humanity has to endure. And I, like most people I know, have a baseline of empathy for that. But I think you can go mad if that's all you think about. So I think most people, to some extent, cultivate a kind of callousness just in order to live, because otherwise society wouldn't function, let alone individuals. And so in that sense, I think we can all identify with being higher up on the food chain than perhaps we deserve. And that, and also as a corollary of that, there are people whose reaction to understanding that that's how the world works is to become a sociopath, is to become, the term is monster of selfishness. And tragically, it strikes me that in recent years, we've seen kind of an epidemic of that at a higher level than maybe ever before, or maybe we just notice it more. Maybe our communications and stuff like the internet and social media have forced us to confront the fact that quite a large percentage of the population of our countries is made up of truly awful people.
And it's something that everyone has to deal with. How do you wrap your mind around the concept that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism when you are entrenched in a capitalist society? You have to live with yourself somehow. Yeah. How do you sleep at night? And different people will manage that in different ways. And some people might just, go to the dark side, as it were, as their coping mechanism. Whereas others may struggle. Some may find a healthy balance, and some may just be in constant agony because it's just so awful.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of, it's not a theme I consciously set out to address when I started this. I didn't actually set out to address many themes, but it's something that I've found I have explored over and over in this series of books, but also in almost all my work. It is that it's a, maybe it's a big theme in all fiction. It's not just unique, something that I do, but the idea of basically how do you live with this is a good question. I've always thought that quite a lot of genre fiction can be boiled down to simple questions. Who done it is brilliant. But I also like the thing that you used to see in puzzle books. What's wrong with this picture? I think that's a great narrative device. But how do you live with this is another one. And perhaps my favorite, it's a line from an old rhythm and blues song. It's what do you do when the lights go out? And I think that's it. Those questions, there's enough for a career of writing in them. Yeah.
And I think that's so much more interesting than the style of vampires. Oh, vampires are automatically evil. They lose their soul and they're just beasts. Because like you were saying back at the beginning, the vampire is this human kind of monster that you can have a conversation with. And if they don't have to have that struggle with their morality, then they lose that humanity, and then they might as well be zombies,
Yeah, that's right. And it's sort of, it's not even in Dracula, but the idea that vampires are inhuman, as it were, or soulless. It means it's all right to kill them. That's the thing. I suppose that's the underlying premise of one of my favorite vampire novels, I Am Legend, is the realization that it's not all right to kill them. Yes. I think that comes, and I'm not entirely sure it's all right to kill zombies. I think there's something unhealthy about that as well. More, it's the way that people in those type of zombie stories seem to enjoy killing zombies. Troubles me.
Who's the real monster here?
Yeah, that's right. But again, that's the premise of Night of the Living Dead in 1968. So it's not exactly hot news. But it is that thing. Who is the real monster? I mean, and again, it's the premise of Frankenstein is who's the monster, isn't it? So that's another good question.
So you mentioned I Am Legend, but what are some of your other favorite vampire books, TV shows, movies?
Oh, right. Well, I really like the Susie McKee Charnis's The Vampire Tapestry, the one about the psychiatrist and the vampire. Brian Stableford's The Empire of Fear, which I probably wouldn't have written Anno Dracula if that book hadn't come out first, because that's an alternate world story with vampires. And the fact that Brian was able to explain it meant that I for a while, I was worried that people just wouldn't get what the premise of this book was. Also, it's a terrific read and a much underrated novel. I really like The Ice Maiden by Mark Baim. I don't know if you know that one. It's about the idea that if you're going to live forever, you need long-term financial security. So it's about a group of vampires who rob a casino. So it's kind of like Ocean's 11 with Vampire Robin Hood. But that's a terrific book that somebody really ought to film. So many others.
Do you have any favorite vampire characters? Certain vampires?
The one that I keep going back to, and I used it as well, it's not quite Dracula, but it's Nosferatu, Count Orlok from the 1922 film, because the look is so great. When I did an Anno Dracula comic, I made Count Orlok a big character in that because I knew the artist would love drawing him. And the thing I have found is that talk to comic book artists, they love drawing certain characters. Count Orlok is one of them. The rat teeth and the ears and the bald head and the eyebrows and everything. It's a really great look. Also, I kind of like the idea that there's got to be some vampire who's worse than everybody else. It's him. I love it that he's like the first screen vampire. He's the most repulsive. He's the most unreasonable. He's the vampire because it's a silent movie. You can't talk to him. Yeah. And I liked the idea that even Dracula had somebody he was embarrassed by, somebody he would like to put away, who was on his team, but still somebody he didn't want in public representing him.
Yeah, you put him in the tower in the book, right? That's
right. Yeah, I make him the prison camp commandant. Is it a bit? Is there where they find him and say, "Is there somebody you had cause to rebuke for being too awful?" And it's him. And it's like even awful people think this guy is terrible. So I enjoy writing him, and he's a character I go back to as well. I think it's a great image. I love that movie.
What's something that you would like to see for the future of vampire fiction? Not necessarily something that you would write, but something you'd like to see out there in the world.
I kind of like to see vampires who were scary, but not in the sense that where you just turn them into zombies, where they're just sort of fast, vicious creatures. I like the idea of vampires who are morally terrifying. Yeah, that air of absolute dread that comes with Nosferatu or the Carl Dreyer film, or even Lugosi's Dracula. The idea that the vampire who walks past a rose bush and it dies. That kind of it would be nice to have a terrifying vampire again.
And it's so hard because people aren't scared of anything these days.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, that's why monster movies went out of fashion after World War II. It's like, but I think people can find things to be terrified of.
Mm-hmm. So you also write stories that aren't about vampires sometimes.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Can you talk about the difference in the experience?
I just write my stories. I mean, I've written quite a range of subject matters. I wrote a book called An English Ghost Story, which is just what it sounds like, a straight ahead family in a haunted house. And I wrote a book called Life's Lottery, which is a choose your own adventure literary novel. I've done a few books with other literary characters from that period I was talking about. I did a book about Professor Moriarty, and I did a book which riffs on the Phantom of the Opera, although it's not about him. It's about Victorian female characters in popular literature. And I've just written a mystery novel set in Hollywood in the late 1930s, which is about Raymond Chandler and Boris Karloff. And this is my first attempt to write, as it were, a historical book about real people that's not in an outrageously fantastical setting like the Anno Dracula books, which have a bunch of real people in. There is magic in the book, but it's trying to write people who really existed as as fictional characters. So that's what my head's round at the moment.
Is that coming out soon, or?
That's coming out this autumn, this fall, and it's called Something More Than Night, and it's due out from Titan Books in November.
Under your regular name?
Absolutely, Kim Newman.
I'll look forward to that.
Please do. I'm not one of those people who think they have a unique take on anything, to be honest. I hope I have a distinctive take. And I hope I've made it mine. It isn't just taking ideas from other people's books and stitching them together, which it does seem like sometimes.
Do you ever have a difficult relationship with the fan fiction discourse? Do you think there's a difference between writing fan fiction of things like Victorian Gothic classics and reimaginings of those versus what is considered modern fan fiction?
The feeling I get from the little sampling I've made is that fan fiction tends to be very character-based. It's based on not just fanishness in the sense of being a devotee of something, but of fantasy, of the idea of you feel you relate to characters in works of fiction and you want to play with them rather than the world they live in, or rather than relate them to the real world or any other purpose. And I get a sense of that sometimes with what I do, but it's not my primary focus. And quite often, as it were, my versions of pre-existing characters do not really stick with the characters as they are. Certainly, I did try with Professor Moriarty to stick pretty closely to what Conan Doyle said about him. But to me, the interesting character in that book is Sebastian Moran, the secondary character, who's the narrator. And Conan Doyle only gives you 2 pages of him. So everything else is stuff I extrapolate. It's a really good 2 pages. There's a lot of great stuff in there, but everything else was extrapolating from it, as opposed to, as it were, exploring the dynamics of the reader's relationship to the character, which I think probably is inherent in most fan fiction. But I say people know this stuff in so much more depth than I do. I am probably floundering to deal with it.
But I think what's most important is whatever, I don't want to say messages, because obviously you don't go in thinking, I'm going to write about this theme. Nobody ever does that. You just write a fun story. But what comes out of it, what speaks to you about it, why you're drawn to it, as an artist.
That's exactly right. It's probably death to go in with a kind of didactic notion of I want to say this. More often, I'll start a project with I want to explore this. And sometimes it's a theme, but more often it's a world, a setting. Sometimes it's specific characters, whether they pre-exist me or not. So I've just done about historic characters. I've done books about fictional characters, and I've done books about characters I've basically just made up.
Like I said, Victorian Gothic mashups are like one of my favorite things. But, some people will say like, well, you're just writing fan fiction. I was like, but there's something about it, though. I
think that's slightly different from fan fiction, but it's like, I think if you can take a very broad definition of what fan fiction is. I also don't think what I do is necessarily pastiche, because that requires a kind of passing off, a kind of literary ventriloquism. There you're trying to simulate the original work, maybe with new stories, but trying not to contradict. Whereas quite often, I think what I do is as much criticism as homage. I have sometimes used characters who from works that I find deeply problematic and use that. I mean, James Bond is an obvious one, a horrible, horrible person. Although in the Victorian sense, the character I've used a bit that is written as a hero, but is actually insufferable, is Raffles, the amateur cracksman, who's a gentleman thief. But he's still a thief. I mean, and it strikes me that even though E.W. Hornung, who wrote the books, the narrative voice is wholly admiring of him and presents him as an admirable character. As a reader, you can't help coming away with feeling that he is a complete swine. And so whenever I've used him as a character, I've played that up.
So you like showing off what was romanticized in the past in a more...
that's right. Yeah, sometimes it's that. And sometimes the interesting, as with Raffles, is going back and finding that we had misread all along. Maybe we were bringing our fantasy to something the original author had perhaps intended or seen or was certainly aware of. And I've done that with one or two other characters. And because obviously I'm not an uncritical admirer of every single work of popular fiction. And I am quite waspish about some things. But also I do quite like discovering characters who are forgotten and giving them some kind of new life.
There was a scene in Anno Dracula where the characters attack people who are homosexuals as a morality sort of like purged, as a way to demonstrate just how terrible they really are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Is that tying back into that like Victorian values?
Yeah, that's right. And obviously that is an exaggeration, but it was something that really happened. There was also a lot of weird hypocrisy going on in that Oscar Wilde went to prison, but a lot of other very prominent gay people didn't. It seemed to me that they didn't actually criminalize homosexuality. They criminalized being gay and annoying. There were plenty of absolute establishment. Many soldiers and statesmen and authors who lived completely untroubled gay lives, but they didn't provoke people into suing them. And I think that was Oscar Wilde's problem. But I also kind of wanted a contrast, a sense that there are always going to be people who get persecuted, and in the 1980s in Britain there was a whole anti-gay crusade that went along with various other elements of Thatcherism, and I kind of wanted to address that. It's something I've sort of rolled back on in subsequent books and played slightly different versions of that story, partly because I know a bit more history now, but and there are other aspects of that side of things that struck me as being interesting then, and I wanted to move on from it. One of the in plot terms, and it's something I only did like in books written many years later. The real reason that Dracula is homophobic is that he had a gay brother he hated. Radu the Handsome, who betrayed him to the Turks, right? And I'd always thought I wanted to write this character at some point. So he came into the last of the Anno Dracula books, Anno Dracula 1999, Dai Kaiju. I actually bring on Radu the Handsome as kind of the reigning Dracula of the era, and he gets to tell his side of the story of why Vlad Dracula hated him. And he's again, he was an awful person, but he was an interestingly awful person. I sort of saw him as like the Frank Stallone of Dracula's. It's like the brother who was completely overshadowed, but actually had done a better job of lots of things. So that was a thread that I laid down in the first book that took me 30 years to get round to tying off.
What a payoff.
I know. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for talking about Dracula and vampires.
Happy to do it.
Bringing your wonderful insight to this.
I try.
Oh, it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this vampire interview. I know I have not yet interviewed a real vampire, probably because vampires aren't real. Yet. This video was generously sponsored by my Patreon patrons, and if you would like to help support me making more videos like this, or critical reviews of vampire media, or discussion of vampire books and games, please consider joining my Patreon. Otherwise, please leave us a comment and let us know your thoughts and feelings about the metaphors and sociological ideas of the vampire. I want to hear it all. Yes, I know, you're very distracted by my fabulous fingernails, aren't you? These fingernails were sent to me by a company called Ooh My Nails as a sample in exchange for wearing them in my videos. They reached out to me and said, hey, would you like some fingernails to wear in your videos? And I said, yes, please. And they're very cool. So many cool gothic designs. They also have non-gothic fingernails for all you normies out there. But the link to the website where you can get these is in the description if you're interested. No, they aren't paying me to say this. I just thought they were very cool. Thank you again for joining me. Until next time, spooky reading. Good night.